Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Women and Gender Equity's EqualiTea speaker series. Today, we are excited to bring you Anti-Rape Activism at the Crossroads of Gender and Racial Justice with Dr. Catherine Jacquet.
So today we have a content warning. We recognize the process of healing looks different for every individual, and we are committed to creating a safe virtual space that allows for folks to take care of themselves when they need it. We believe that engaging in these discussions is important for our community and our audience members, and we are devoted to doing so with care, consideration, and sensitivity. We want to support our audience members by inviting you to take a break, step away, or exit this webinar as needed in order to take care of yourself, as we will be engaging in themes of sexual violence/harm, gender-based violence or harm, misogyny, racism, racist violence or harm, and examples of white supremacist violence and police and/or state violence or harm.
Okay. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Catherine Jacquet. Catherine Jacquet is an associate professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at Louisiana State University, where she teaches courses in U.S. history, women's history, the history of sexuality, Black feminist theory and activism, and LGBTQ activism. Her book, The Injustices of Rape, How Activists Respond to Sexual Violence, 1950 to 1980s, was published with the University of North Carolina Press in fall of 2019. Her current research explores prison rape in the era of mass incarceration, focusing on activism and organizing to end sexual violence in U.S. carceral institutions. Her research has been published in the Journal of Women's History and the Radical History Review. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to our speaker.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm totally delighted to be here today and to be sharing my work with you all and to really be in conversation. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A after my short presentation. So I want to thank the Center for Women and Gender Equity at Westchester University for inviting me here as part of the EqualiTea series. Big shout out to Tess Bedser for all they have done to make this event happen. Thank you, Tess. And also thanks so much to Dana and Tasia, who are peer educators with the center, who are going to be moderating the Q&A afterwards. So, and welcome everyone in the audience. It's great to have you all here. So let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, y'all can see that, right? So the title of my talk today is Anti-Rape Activism at the Crossroads of Gender and Racial Justice. And I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about that title and how it relates to my book. Here is the cover of my book. As you can see, the title is The Injustices of Rape, and there's just like a very nice graphic design with two different triangles intersecting. I was very happy with the graphic design that they did for it. So my book looks at the history of anti-rape activism from 1950 to 1980. And the two major movements for social justice that were addressing rape and sexual harm at that time period in fairly significant ways were the Black freedom movement. And I use that term as a more expansive way to think about the civil rights movement, because typically civil rights we think of as, fairly short, truncated, but Black freedom movement, much, more expansive. And the women's liberation movement or the modern feminist movement. Those were the two movements that were significantly addressing sexual violence. And so those were the two movements that I researched and wrote about. So here I have on the left, you can see there's a photograph of Black men and women dressed in suits and dresses with signs as they're on a march. This was an NAACP march in Jacksonville, Florida in April of 1964. I'm using it as my image for civil rights activism and Black freedom movement. And then on the right, you'll see also a black and white photo of women marching with banners and fists in the air and the women's symbol with the fist through it. This is from a 1971 march. I'm not exactly quite sure where actually, but that is my photo for women's liberation movement. So as a historian, I'm interested in questions of how and why people take up an issue and fight for change and fight for justice, whether that be as individuals, within small or local groups, or by situating themselves within larger social justice movements. So for this book, I was interested in looking at how people had defined sexual violence historically, whose accounts were deemed politically relevant and why, and how those definitions impacted both the scope and the kinds of responses to rape. So going back to those two movements, what's important here is that racial and gender justice activists came to their anti-rape analyses from their own respective frameworks of injustice. And this had very important consequences for anti-rape campaigns within those movements. So who activists supported, the injustices that they identified, and the kinds of changes that they sought. So when we look at the dominant discourse on rape coming out of the Black freedom movement, we see that rape was defined as racial injustice. So in other words, the larger problem was white supremacy, and rape was the manifestation of racist oppression. In theorizing rape as a tool of white supremacy, activists concentrated their attention solely on interracial sexual violence. So mobilization efforts centered on Black women assaulted by white men, as well as Black men who were either falsely accused or excessively punished for raping white women. So the images here in the upper left-hand corner, you see a group of, well, they're actually all teenagers, of Black teenagers in front of prison bars, with what looks like, a jailer and a sheriff, and a white man sitting in front who's the lawyer. These are the Scottsboro boys. This is one of the most infamous cases of a false rape allegation in United States history. I'm going to come back to it, but that was just an example of defending Black men who are falsely accused. Then you see on the left, on the bottom here, this headline, "Dixie Sex Crimes Against Negro Women Widespread." That's a headline from 1944, and it's speaking to the fact that in the South, Black women were at an incredibly high risk of violence by white men, and it happened so frequently. It was completely widespread and very well known and understood and documented. And then this other headline here on the right says, "Taylor case rally tonight will demand justice for a rape victim." And that's referring to the case of Recy Taylor, who was a Black woman in 1944 who was abducted by a group of white men, gang raped. And despite the fact that she had a positive ID, the sheriff refused to arrest any of her assailants, and there were no indictments. So there was no justice for Recy Taylor. So when racial justice activists took up the cause of Black men and Black women, these efforts were absolutely necessary. They were critically important. But there were also limitations in their focus on interracial sexual violence. And number one, that focus left out the largest group of Black rape victims, and that's Black women who were assaulted by Black men. Studies showed at the time and still today that rape is largely an intraracial crime. So that, that did not fit into the analysis here. And then secondly, racial justice activists also sometimes reinforced sexist beliefs and myths about victims in their defense of Black men, really relying on the trope of, women who lie and, make false allegations. So this is tricky because we know this happened. We know that white women lied about rape by Black men. The Emmett Till case, for example, Carolyn Bryant is a perfect example of that. But in relying on that, this also would have detrimental impacts by using that in the defense, because it furthered the idea that all women who alleged rape were lying, including women of color. Now, the dominant discourse on rape coming out of the women's liberation movement, which in the early 1970s was a predominantly white women's movement, this articulated an understanding of rape as a gender injustice. So in other words, it was the result of male dominance and patriarchy, and rape was a manifestation of sexism. So this reflected a tendency within the women's movement, again, that's dominated by white women at the time, to focus on gender as the primary cause of oppression in women's lives, excluding other factors such as race or class. And then this image here, it's one of my favorite posters produced by feminist anti-rape activists. It says disarm rapists, smash sexism on it. And you see this white woman giving a karate kick and a punch to a guy who's falling backwards. It was created by Betsy Warrior in the early 1970s, and she was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I just kind of love this poster. So anyway, using this analytical frame, white feminists theorized rape only as the result of sexism and male supremacy. So any woman assaulted by any man was politically salient to the movement, regardless of race. So what this does is it opens up room to address both interracial and intraracial sexual violence. However, most white feminists who were involved in anti-rape campaigns focused their energies solely on women victims, and they didn't typically consider the situation of Black men who were victims of legal injustice, either because they were falsely accused or excessively punished on rape charges. So this feminist framework, this dominant feminist framework, did not challenge the racism that was inherent in the criminal legal system. And in addition, most feminists defined rape as a crime committed by men against women. So their analysis did not effectively engage with the reality that men and boys were also victims of sexual assault. And their analysis also largely left out queer, trans, and non-binary folks. Although to be fair, non-binary was not a way that people identified in the 1970s. I mean, I think that, that's very, very recent. But anyway, so their analysis was, lacking on those points as well. Okay, so one group is using a lens of racial justice. Another group is using a lens of gender justice. And I was interested in looking at how those two movements sometimes aligned, how they sometimes clashed, and where and if they fit together. So that's what I mean when I use this term, the crossroads of gender and racial justice. And here we have a lovely image from the internet of a sunset setting over fields, and you have two roads crisscrossing one another there. Now, what's important to point out here is that the dominant discourses that activists produced were based in what we now call single axis frameworks. So, today when we're thinking about feminism, for example, right, we have a much more expansive understanding, right? Like any feminism that's worth even considering is going to address anti-racism. It's going to address racial justice, right? You can't have feminism without that. And likewise for racial justice movements, right? They're going to be addressing sexism and, addressing ableism, classism, all of these different things, right? But while activists are organizing in these movements, right, it's really much more of a single axis framework and less of an intersectional approach, which we're all familiar with now. And so while the work that they do, again, is profoundly important, and I will give you some examples of that, there are those limitations. And so that's what I mean by the crossroads and kind of some of those central tensions that I explore in the book. We're good? Are everybody still with me? Okay, cool. So of course, right, we have these two movements as single axis frameworks, but of course, not everybody theorized using a single axis framework at this time. So many activists historically did take up a more expansive and intersectional framework. We typically conceptualize the Black freedom and the women's liberation movements as two distinct movements for social justice, but activists themselves complicate this neat, oversimplified separation. So Black feminists, for example, they articulated an analysis of rape that sat at the intersection of both of these movements. And these activists challenged the distinctions between a racial justice and a gender justice agenda, arguing instead, as I kind of, try to explain, that true racial justice included an analysis of patriarchal oppression, while true gender justice included an analysis of racism and white supremacy. So a Black feminist approach demanded that the Black freedom movement address sexism within the movement and outside of the movement, and that the women's liberation movement address racism. So activists like these push their movements to expand their anti-rape analysis and account for both racial and gender injustice. But this intersectional approach, again, was not the dominant discourse. It was not foregrounded by either the Black freedom or the women's liberation movement. And so this lack of attention to that intersectional analysis is what would lead to major conflicts, both within movements and between those two movements. So the image that I have here, as you can see, is a group of Black women marching in the foreground. This is in Boston in 1979. They were protesting the lack of media coverage and police attention to the murders of 12 Black women that had happened in Boston that year. And the banner that they're carrying says, "Third world women, we cannot live without our lives." So Black feminists and other activists like them, I don't know if they're necessarily the heroes of my story. I mean, I'd say that my book has a lot of heroes in it. All the folks who are doing the work to reduce harm, to save lives, to fight against the carceral state, those are maybe all my heroes in my book. But if we're thinking about lessons learned and thinking about our own activism today, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the Q&A, it's really looking at the work of Black feminists, both historically and in our current context, that can really inform our own thinking today. But we can talk more about that during the Q&A. So let's dive into the book a little bit here. I kind of laid out some of the central tensions in the analysis to give you all a sense of the book more broadly. The book chronicles the ways in which activists identified sexual violence as a critical site of injustice and the strategies that they developed to respond to that injustice. So during this time period, activists defended Black men in the courts, sometimes saving their lives. They claimed Black women's rights to bodily autonomy. They demanded that women victims be heard and believed, and they exposed the inadequacies of the legal and medical systems. Activists identified and disputed what they called rape myths that fueled the prevalence and trauma of rape. They successfully reformed rape laws and medical protocols, and they challenged the prevailing views on race and gender that had contributed to the injustices of rape. So the unrelenting work and advocacy by activists, scholars, and lawyers profoundly altered the national response to sexual violence. For an observer in the late 1970s, the legal, medical, and cultural understandings and responses to rape had made a radical and undeniable shift from 30 years prior. So just to tell you all a little bit about these images on the screen here, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a woman, she's on the telephone, she's taking notes. Behind her is what looks like the front page of a newspaper called Forward Times, and it says, "Women declare war on rape." This image, it speaks to the fact that feminist anti-rape activists, they created the first rape crisis hotlines. They created the first rape crisis centers. They were out helping survivors of sexual violence navigate the legal system, the medical system. They did major overhaul of the laws of sexual violence. They really started a very profound movement against. Well, I mean, they didn't start. I mean, there's been movements before. They were part of a very profound movement and shift in national responses to sexual violence. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a Black woman. She's in front of a courthouse. This is from the Joanne Little trial, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And she's holding a sign that says, "We will defend ourselves against sexual assault." I'll tell you more about that image in just a minute. In the upper right-hand corner, you have three young Black men. One's actually a teenager in front of prison bars. These are three of the Groveland Four, and these were Black men who were falsely accused of raping a white woman in Groveland, Florida. I'm going to tell you that story in a minute, so we're just going to hold on to it. And then the bottom right is you see the women's symbol. It says "Stop Rape" in the middle, and this is the cover. The Detroit Women Against Rape, which was an anti-rape group, feminist anti-rape group in Detroit, put together this manual about sexual violence. It included everything from self-defense techniques to explaining to women what's going to happen in the legal process, what's happening in the medical process, all from a feminist point of view. Okay, so let me tell you about two things I want to cover from the book. First, I want to talk about rape, race, and the death penalty. And then I'll talk briefly about that Joanne Little case. And then we can move into the Q&A. So first, I want to think about rape, race, and the death penalty. So when we look at the modern campaign against the death penalty and against capital punishment, it emerges in 1963, and the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So that's the I'm going to shorten it, the LDF. So the LDF was the legal arm of the NAACP. These were the lawyers that were, getting civil rights activists out of jail. These were the lawyers who were defending civil rights activists in the court. They were the ones going after segregation laws in the courts, right? That's the LDF. So in 1963, they pursue a campaign against the death penalty. And the reason that they do that is because they saw that Black men who were convicted of raping white women were disproportionately punished with death as compared to their white counterparts. So here is a pie graph that illustrates that. Between 1930 and 1965, 87% of those who were executed for rape were Black. And this is always on interracial rape charges. So it's always cases with a white victim. So to put it another way, of the 455 men executed for rape between 1930 and 1965, 405 of them were Black. And in the mid-20th century, some of you might be surprised that there was the death penalty for rape. So in the mid-20th century, rape was a capital crime in 18 states and Washington, D.C. And all of those states were Southern or border states, which may not come as a surprise. I think that tells us a lot. So criminologists and the statistics alike confirmed that capital punishment for rape in the South had an undeniable racial bias. And defenders of Black men coined the term legal lynching to describe what was going on in cases of Black-white rape. Now, as a side note, we all know that racism is a national problem. It's not a regional problem. It's not confined to the South. But in the case of the death penalty, Black men weren't being executed on rape charges in the North because that, like in northern states, because that was not legal there. It just happens that it was legal in the South. So defending Black men who were either falsely accused or excessively punished for raping white women becomes a major battleground of the Black freedom movement. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about these images I showed you earlier. So in the upper left-hand corner, this is the group who were called the Scottsboro Boys. This is a case it begins in 1931 in Scottsboro. It doesn't begin in Scottsboro. It's 9 teenagers. They were between the ages of 13 and 19, and they were on a train going from Chattanooga to Memphis. And they're accused of raping 2 white women on this train. The train stops in Paint Rock, Alabama. They get indicted in Scottsboro. So that's why it becomes known as, the Scottsboro case and the Scottsboro Boys. So within a month of the accusation, you have the all white jury, you've got the mob-like atmosphere. They're all sentenced to death. And then following this, you have enormous efforts by the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Communist Party. One of the women retracts her testimony, but the Scottsboro Boys, as they came to be known, they end up spending between 6 and 19 years in prison for a crime that they did not commit. Another example of this is the Groveland Four. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see this image with 3 young Black men in front of prison bars, and that's the jailer and the sheriff, the white guys next to them. A white woman alleged sexual violence. She accused these people. One of them was a teenager. 2 of them were World War II vets. None of them even knew each other. So it was a false allegation. It brought total hysteria. 600 white men drove in, this was in Groveland, Florida. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. In 1949. So 600 white men, a mob, drives into Groveland trying to get the accused. They're not able to access them. So the mob starts shooting into and setting Black homes on fire. It was a total disaster. So what ends up happening with originally the four, one of them had escaped before he was even arrested, and he's shot and killed 200 miles away. Another one of these young men is shot by the sheriff. And the other one does survive. And then the youngest one also survives and ends up serving 10 years in prison. So one serves 20 years in prison, the other 10 years in prison, both for crimes that they did not commit. And again, I give all these examples just to really explain to you what that situation looked like for Black men in the South who were accused of rape by white women, and how absolutely devastating those accusations could be. And then your bottom photo is the Martinsville Seven. These are 7 Black men in Martinsville, Virginia, who they were guilty. I mean, they did gang rape a white woman. This was not a false allegation. This actually did happen, but they were sentenced to death. And the state of Virginia did execute these men in February of 1951, despite all the appeals and all the attempts by the NAACP to try to save their lives. They were not able to. And so that's an example of the very excessive punishments that Black men would face in these cases. Okay, the next case I want to talk about very briefly before we go to the Q&A is about Joanne Little. So her name was pronounced Joanne, even though in the legal record it was spelled Joan. So that's why I have both spellings here on the screen. This is Joanne Little, and the woman on the left. And then in the black and white photo next to her, you can see people are holding signs that say "Justice for Joanne." They're holding a rally in front of the courthouse for her. So in August of 1974, Joanne Little was a 21-year-old prisoner at the Beaufort County Jail in Beaufort County, North Carolina. A white officer at the jail attempted to sexually assault her. He came into her cell with an ice pick as his weapon. She was able to get the ice pick away from him, use it on him, and then escaped. A warrant was then issued for her arrest, and she did turn herself in, and then she was charged with first-degree murder, which at the time in North Carolina carried the death penalty. So word about this case gets out, and a national movement coalesces in her defense. So the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, and the prisoners' rights movement all rally around Joanne Little. So this is this really cool moment where we see the convergence of anti-rape politics across social movements. And so all of these activists agreed that Little was the victim of state-sanctioned or state-generated violence. It's this shared critique that brings them together. So first, she's attacked by her jailer, right? And a jailer works for the state, right? He's an agent of the state. He's acting as an arm of the state. She saves herself, right? She uses self-defense to protect herself, but then the state charges her with first-degree murder, as opposed to the person who tried to attack her. So this is, there were marches nationwide across the country in her defense. This is a march that was in Raleigh, North Carolina, but right before the trial. And you can see all the different groups here carrying banners. You have everyone from the Black Panther Party demanding freedom for Sister Joanne Little. You can see another poster says, women have a right to self-defense. You can see stop the racist attacks on women prisoners, stop slave labor in North Carolina prisons. So activists were not having it with this case. This is another great flyer from the time. It was created by the Chicago Women's Committee to Free Joanne Little. Again, this is a nationwide effort, right? Joanne Little's in North Carolina. Here you have this committee organized in Chicago. So it says justice wanted for Joanne Little, crime in scare quotes, self-defense against rape. So women's right to self-defense, this is going to really resonate both with the feminist movement and also with the Black freedom movement. You know, after literally centuries of assault, you know, against Black women by white men, the Joanne Little case is really going to resonate here. And also the feminist movement as well, who are big advocates of women being able to defend themselves from attacks. So the slogan, "Power to the Ice Pick," becomes a rallying cry of the movement. Again, the jailer tried to attack her with the ice pick. She used it as a weapon against him. So they kind of take up that slogan. So Black women were really at the forefront of the Free Joanne Little movement. The local base of the movement in North Carolina was predominantly Black women. And nationwide, Black women are very much invested and involved in this organizing. Again, Little's case really resonated with this long history of unpunished interracial sexual violence and the constant threat of state violence in the lives of Black women. Bernice Johnson Reagan of Sweet Honey in the Rock, I don't know if anybody knows who she is anymore, or everybody's too young and you don't know, but anyway, she records a song about Joanne Little. All the profits she makes from that song goes towards the defense. Angela Davis, I think you all know who she is. She meets with Little's legal team, and she also writes a very influential article about the case in Ms. Magazine, which was a feminist magazine that's still in publication today, calling out the clear racism and the sexism in the case, drawing out those intersections. In these photos here, you could see on the left-hand side, there's a group of women with signs, Black women with signs. And, this one here is, her sign says, "We will defend ourselves against sexual assaults." And then on the right, you have another Black woman, holding up the flyer for the rally. On her shirt, it says "Free Joanne Little." And I don't know if you can read it, but her shirt does say "Power to the Ice Pick" on it. So connecting back to that. So Little's legal defense team, they very effectively cast this case as one of Southern justice on trial, calling out the histories of racial injustice and racism. The case goes to trial in July of 1975, and Joanne Little is acquitted in August of 1975. It's a huge victory for all the movements and all of her supporters. Pretty shocking, but she was acquitted, surprisingly. So anyway, I feel like I've been talking long enough, so I am going to stop my screen share now, and let's open it up for Q&A.
Thank you. That was amazing. As we move into this Q&A portion of events, we have a few questions to start off, and we invite different folks in the audience, wherever, to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions you may have as well. Our first question is can you tell us how you got into this research?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So there's kind of like a two-part answer. So number one, as a historian, I'm really interested in studying how people make change. And I love studying the history of activism, social justice, and how people organize. But sexual violence, as somebody who was born female and identifies as such and was raised as a woman in this world, and has many, many friends who also identify that way, I've always been acutely aware of sexual harm, right? And everything from sexual harassment through sexual violence. Like I think everybody here, we all know people who have experienced sexual harm in various manifestations. People who identify as masculine men, or as feminine or women or however, right? I mean, like, sexual violence is not limited to women identified folks by any stretch of the imagination. But growing up as a woman in this culture, it was something I experienced and something a lot of my friends experienced, sexual harm, right, more broadly. And so because my friends had experienced this, and this was a particular moment where a friend of mine had experienced this, I just started researching, right? I was like, how did people organize against sexual violence historically? What can I learn from the past that will help me try to make my way through the world here? So it was a combination of, already interested in organizing and mobilization and social justice and historically, but then also very deep personal, it was deeply personal to then also be studying sexual violence because of the impact that has had on the lives of so many people in who are in my circles.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because like I know myself, like knowing so many women and so many people have had these experiences, it's just like that want to know more, like how to make these changes and how to do things like that. So I really appreciate you sharing that. This is kind of a follow-up question to our first question, but who did you want to reach with this research? Like who is your audience? Who are you trying to kind of reach with this?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I published with an academic press. So really, you know, when we publish our first book, it's because we need to get tenure. So we have to publish a book. So you publish with the academic press, and so the audience is your university, so they will give you tenure. But all joking aside, I was hopeful that this was a study that would be used in classrooms, in women's studies classrooms, in history classrooms, sociology, across the humanities. But I was also hoping that it wouldn't only be a book that was read within the confines of the university. I was also hoping that activists, like modern day activists, could learn the histories, right? So modern day anti-violence activists would learn or get to know the history of our current movement, to understand how it is that we got to where we are today, and also to consider what changes do we need to make, like what has worked in the past, what didn't. And of course, those are different historical contexts, but thinking about like what lessons we can learn from our predecessors.
Thank you. And like I kind of have like a kind of present day question. Like you really gave a comprehensive overview of anti-rape movements throughout our history. And as you know, like everything's online nowadays. So with the emergence of social media activism, especially, how do you think we can incorporate these ideas and make an impact online?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, social media is tricky because it can very effectively spread messages, but then it can also, I mean, you guys have all been in Facebook fights. I mean, you know what it is, because people shut down. So I think, part of the work is education. And so I think, getting more messaging out there that reflects a feminist, anti-racist, anti-carceral message, I think is really important. I think, a lot of ways people are getting their information now is through social media. So I think being able to have these conversations and engage with one another through using, feminist lenses, anti-racist lenses, if we can do that online, I think that can be useful if people are willing to engage online. But just to know, I think about some of the stuff that I've read on Facebook. I don't even know if you guys look at Facebook anymore. Maybe that's like an old person thing. Okay, well, whatever social media you're on, Instagram, or I don't know, whatever. To be having to put that messaging out there and hoping that it's not just like in an echo chamber where we all think the same. But honestly, I have learned from folks on social media, like people will check me on stuff, right? I mean, like I'm able, I think we are able to have, some of us, good conversations via social media and get the messaging out there.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I've definitely experienced that on social media. Like I'll post something to my story. I mainly use Instagram for things like that, but like I'll post something on my story and then people will like respond and we'll start to have conversations about things. And I think it's really important, like, and especially now in our entirely virtual world, to be able to like connect in those ways. So I think it's really cool that social media is kind of like becoming a little part of it. So this question is gearing more towards like the criminal justice system. So with the mistrust that people feel in the criminal justice system, how can we resist sexual violence and assault by taking matters into our own hands? And then also, how can we empower college students and other folks on campus to partake in this resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the problem with the criminal legal system is, number one, it's just profoundly racist and classist. And if you look at who is being arrested, who's being held in jail, who's being convicted, I mean, the statistics speak for themselves. So I think the problem is, I think our automatic knee-jerk reaction is, if there's sexual violence or sexual harm, we call the cops, right? But the problem with that is, what if the cops are the rapists? Who are you going to call? And this is really something that Black feminists and women of color feminists have been talking about for decades. When we're thinking about state violence against particularly women of color, we can't rely on the state to help us, right? And so I think rather than pursuing this kind of, your kind of like punishment angle, because honestly, that doesn't change. Like, okay, feminist activists in the 1970s, feminists of color and white feminists pushed for and fought for legal reform because the laws on sexual violence were so archaic, y'all, right? I mean, it was like that archaic definition of like, carnal knowledge with a woman, not his wife, whatever. And like in some states like New York, and so in New York, there was a corroboration requirement, which meant you needed to have somebody have witnessed your rape to then successfully prosecute it. I mean, it was completely absurd. And there was actually this article in the New York Magazine from, I think, 73, that basically the argument was like, you can rape somebody and get away with it, but you can't steal their TV and get away with it. Like, it's easier to prosecute somebody for stealing your TV, than for sexually assaulting you. So the laws did need to be changed, and it was good that they were changed. However, what has legal reform brought? I think some people's experiences in the courtrooms might, some people have better experiences now, but like a lot of people, that their experiences are just as horrifying as they were in the 1970s, right? Victim blaming continues. All the kinds of rape myths continue that people bring with them and their biases into those spaces. So, the law is not an effective solution to this problem. And this is something, again, that women of color feminists, and particularly Black feminists, have been saying for decades. And so we need to think about what is causing sexual violence and think really deeply about that. And then think about how do we change that, right? I mean, we need like a whole cultural shift and change. And there's actually a really good book, and I can chat it into the chat later, but it's called The Feminist and the Sex Offender. And this is the challenge of women of color feminists too, is recognizing how do we address sexual harm without relying on the carceral state. So and that's tricky, right? Because I think automatically we think, oh, the cops will save us, but we know the cops won't save us. And in fact, depending on how we understand us, I'm speaking as a white person, right? But in fact, the cops are killing a lot of us, or well, they're not killing white people like me, right? I mean, the cops are not going to be the solution. And you see that too with cases of domestic violence where the police get called and the woman who's being battered, she's the one who gets arrested, right? So, I mean, you see this time and time again. So I think that was kind of a long-winded answer, but that's where I got to.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna check out that book. I'm gonna definitely check that out.
Yeah, I have not read the whole thing. I mean, it's in my pile of books that I must read. So but anyway, it's good
I have
stuff.
the same. I have a book buying addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So your research demonstrates many of the ways Black and women's liberation movements focused on legal reform, as the law was often a site of systemic injustice, as the legal system codified white male privilege. In recent years, in response to police brutality and systemic oppression, there have been many calls from activist spaces and racial justice focused and gender justice focused alike for abolition of the carceral state and defunding the police. What might present day activists learn from these historical movements for legal reform? Do you believe that reform was always the goal of the activists, or was it a compromise reached when abolition proved challenging?
Yeah, so I think, there's always been feminist activists who were also had a critique of the carceral state. Here's another book that we can put in the chat. This is so important. This is Emily Thuma's work, All Our Trials. And this is about what we would people we would define as anti-carceral feminists who were working in communities to respond to sexual violence without relying on the carceral state. It's a fabulous book. And she also talks about like women in prisons organizing against, sexual violence in prisons. Thank you, Tess, for putting those in the chat. So yeah, like I said, I think those legal reform in the law was absolutely imperative and important. It did not result in the kinds of changes that some folks had hoped it would result in. And, but many feminists were very cautious about this because they recognized that the law was dominated by men. The courts, right? If you're thinking about who's serving in all those positions, and feminists of all races, right? They really wanted a cultural revolution. And so law reform and these kinds of reform-minded ideas had to go hand in hand with this much larger cultural transformation. And the problem is once feminists started organizing against sexual violence, the state, as the entity that is charged with protecting its citizens, right? I mean, the state then gets on board and they're like, okay, we're going to train our police and we're going to improve our systems. And, the state as like a larger apparatus really takes on the anti-rape movement as its own. And this is one of the problems, because those original like feminist ideals of, smashing sexism, cultural revolution, that gets kind of pushed away to the side. And then the focus becomes, change the laws, change the way things go in the courts, like do all that. So the revolution is left unfinished. Now, of course, especially women of color, but also, white feminists who identified as socialist feminists or who had a more critical analysis were always warning against this. And they were always warning about the power of the state and how what was going to happen was just a carceral buildup. And you can lock up as many people as you want, but that's not going to change the rates of sexual violence, right? And it hasn't. So I don't know, did I just answer the question? But anyway, so we can take the lead from both those activists, but nowadays, right, I mean, who's on the forefront of the anti-violence movement? It's women of color. And here's another book for Tess to put into the chat. Insight is a group of radical women of color who are working against violence. And so this is their anthology. It's called Color of Violence. I can't recommend this book enough. So these women have been, demanding a way to address sexual violence and sexual harm that does not rely on the carceral state, because that state also causes incredible harm, particularly to communities of color. So that work is being done. So I guess my answer is listen to Black women, listen to women of color, follow their lead. They've got this. That is the direction we need to be following. If we're thinking about like our contemporary movement, it's got to be following in the lead of Insight, because that's the kind of transformative work that's going to actually bring change.
Thank you. Oh, it looks like we have a question in the Q&A, so I'll jump over to that. This question is, how do we combat conversations that are one or the other about race and sexual violence? We saw a lot this summer to counter Black Lives Matter folks oh my gosh, I can't speak. I'm gonna start sober. How do we combat conversations that are one or the other about race and sexual violence? We saw a lot this summer to counter Black Lives Matter folks change the conversations towards sex trafficking.
Oh, I see. Oh yeah, so it's like kind of used as a way to like change the conversation with, so that we don't have to focus on racism anymore. Like, oh, well, what about this? Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a really smart trick, right? That people will try to use of like the detractor or right. Whereas what we need to have is a much more comprehensive analysis to be looking at all of these problems in tandem or like simultaneously, right? That it's not just like, oh, okay, is this somehow like, I think part of the problem is just like, we're gonna like, oh, are we addressing a racial injustice or a gender injustice, as if those two things could be separated. And so I think it's kind of, I think part of the challenge then is to respond with a much more, is holistic the word, or like a comprehensive framework that takes into account all of these different systems and how they're working in tandem, and thinking about, things more systematically. I don't know if that answers the question, if I understood the question correctly. Yeah.
Yes, I think that was good. I understood what you're saying.
Okay.
I think we can squeeze in one more question before 5, and let's get into something about your book.
Okay.
In chapter 2 of Injustices of Rape, McGuire's research on Black women, rape, and resistance categorized the history of the civil rights movement as rooted in African Americans' long struggle against sexual violence, and identified other major campaigns of the civil rights movement as being connected to organized resistance to sexual violence and appeals for protection of Black womanhood. This history is rarely included in the cultural legacy of the civil rights movement.
That's right.
What are some examples you would point to in painting a more historically accurate picture of the influence anti-rape activism had on the civil rights movement?
Yeah. So a major problem when we're looking at the history of civil rights activism, until very recently, it was very much focused on the men and the work that men did. And Black women historians had to set the record straight, and really make it clear that, like, you might have had some leaders that were well known, like MLK, Abernathy, Malcolm X, and they all did incredible work, and we're not suggesting they didn't, but Black women were the backbone of that movement, and that movement would not have happened without Black women. And so the record has been corrected, or it's a work in progress, right? Black women historians have been trying to set the record straight for decades. But another piece of this, and this is McGuire's work, is so important. I didn't pull her book out, but I have it on my shelf here. This is another excellent book. Y'all are going to come out of this talk with like a reading list. I apologize, but you have a lot of reading to do. But she writes about this history of Black women's anti-rape activism. A lot of folks, as she says, they cut their political teeth defending Black women who were victims of white male sexual violence. Rosa Parks is one of those people. I mean, Rosa Parks, first of all the mythology around Rosa Parks that we have, and that, like, we love to use her as this national symbol. Of course, the federal government loves her now. I mean, they hated her when she was alive for most of her life. Same with Martin Luther King Jr. We love celebrating him now, but he was one of the most hated people by the US government during his lifetime. But anyway, I digress. But Rosa Parks, before she refused to get up from the bus, she was, that Reese Taylor case that I mentioned earlier, she was the chief investigator from the NAACP on that case from 1944. That's 11 years before the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. So, we need to make sure we get the stories accurately of the civil rights movement, and who is involved. And even the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Typically it's like King Lee is at the helm of that. That entire bus boycott was organized and sustained by Black women who had already organized. I think it was the Women's Political Caucus in Montgomery. They were totally organized. They were ready for a bus boycott, and that boycott was able to happen because of them. The issue of segregation on buses was also, it was not just about Black folks being able to sit in the front of the bus, but it was also about Black women being able to sit with dignity and respect, because they were treated so horribly, and they were sexually harmed by the bus drivers. They were physically assaulted, called demeaning sexual names. So, and that's another part of the story that we don't hear about, that the movement against bus segregation was also a movement for Black women to sit with dignity, and not be sexually harmed and sexually harassed while they were riding the bus, either by the bus drivers or by the cops that would come and remove them very violently from the bus. So yeah, we have a lot more to learn. and that history, thankfully Danielle McGuire published her amazing book and did her research, but yeah, it's all connected.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because honestly, some of the things that you're just saying in that answer, like I didn't know about, and I think it's so important to just constantly be just like learning and be like a little sponge. That's how I feel right now.
Yeah, I love being a sponge too. I'm like, I just want to know everything.
It's
Yeah.
also interesting, and I think it's so important to know these histories so that you can apply them to today. It's like you have to
Absolutely.
learn from the past. So I think we should be wrapping things up now. It's about 5. But I just want to thank you so much for your time and joining us today. And to our participants, thank you so much for your time as well, and the energy and commitment that you all have to equality. I appreciate it so much. It looks like we did lose Tasia. I think her laptop died, so unfortunately
Okay.
she did an Irish goodbye, but
Okay. Well, please tell her I said thank you.
of course.
And thanks to you, Dana, and again to Tess and everybody for being here. I so appreciate you listening and being part of the conversation. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, and if anybody has further questions or comments or information, y'all at the center have my email address, so I'm more than happy if people want to contact me. That would be great. I'm always open to hearing from folks.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, y'all.
Bye.